Okay. All right. We are recording. We have this class. We don't have a class next week, November the 20th. And then, next week we don't have a class. November the 27th, December the 4th, December the 11th, and then December the 18th will be the final. And so there are those things. Last week we talked about starting right and ending right, and we mentioned some things there with that. And tonight I want to talk about, if we get to it, two things. Number one, this is from the book Public Speaking and Influencing Men in Business by Dale Carnegie. It is chapter 5, and it's the keeping the audience awake. And I thought that was pretty good due to the fact that we have a problem with that sometimes. I don't know about everybody else, but I do. And so we need to see what we can do about keeping people's attention. And he is talking about our enthusiasm then in this chapter, I think can be summed up in one word. He talks about Sherman Rogers, who was a lumberjack. And in this lumberjack, he was not formally trained as an orator. He was genuinely a lumberjack. He knows nothing or cares less about the rules of public speaking. He is not polished. He lacks finesse, but he has fire or enthusiasm. He had grammatical errors, and he had then things that he didn't do according to Hoyle, but that's not what he was all about. He was then teaching. He was not preaching. He was teaching. Everything he said lapped and flaming hot from the heart. So he was teaching from the heart and speaking from the heart. The secret of his success was then every great movement, or the secret of his success is every great movement in the annals of history, said Emerson, is the triumph of enthusiasm. So that's what he had. This enthusiasm is derived from two Greek words, en, meaning in, and theos, theos, meaning God. Enthusiasm then is literally God in us. Enthusiastic man then is one who speaks as if he is possessed by God. And I thought that was pretty good since we are dealing with preaching. This quality is most effective and most important factor in advertising and selling goods. And if you look at the gospel, we are then in the selling of goods. We are selling the gospel. We want people to buy it, although it doesn't cost anything. We still need that idea of enthusiasm. Wrigley, several years ago, of course, this was several years ago, came to Chicago with less than $50 in his pocket, but now he sells over 30 million worth of chewing gum every year. And on the wall of his private office, he has nothing great was ever achieved without enthusiasm. So I think you'll see that enthusiasm then is what we're talking about. In years past, Dale Carnegie thought that reliance in the rules of public speaking was important, but now when he wrote this book, he says that he put more faith in the spirit of speaking. So that is true. I had one sometime a long time ago talked about people who were enthusiastic and speaking from the heart. They were people who were fired up about something. And the one illustration that was used was about their light bill. And they got their power bill, and they were really upset about their power bill. And so they got into the idea of public speaking, and it wasn't how they were saying, it was what they were saying that got people involved in this. And that's what we're talking about. It's not necessarily the how, but it is the how, but it is because of the enthusiasm and what we are saying then and where it comes from. It needs to come then from deep within. We need to be stirred up about what we're speaking. Eloquence, one man said, may be defined as the speech of a man who knows what he is talking about and means what he says. It is the thought on fire. Knowledge is of little use to the speaker without earnestness. Persuasive speech is from heart to heart, from mind and not mind to mind. And that's what we need to be achieving, is from heart to heart. The Latin poet also expressed his thoughts when he says, if you would draw tears from others' eyes, yourself the design of grief must show. So, and I've seen that happen, that when I've had tears in my eyes, that there were others in the audience that would also have tears in their eyes. So it comes from that. Martin Luther said if he wished to write or compose a prayer or a preach well, then he must be angry. It's enthusiasm, really, is what he's talking about. Then all the blood in my veins is stirred and my understanding is sharpened. The intense earnest, I think, might be a better word for those. Even a horse can be affected by spirited talk. I really find this amazing, too. There was a fellow who was a famous animal trainer that said that he would talk to the horse in an angrily way, and the horse's heartbeat would rise 10 beats per minute. That's amazing. And so here, then, surely an audience is as sensitive as a horse. So if we can get enthusiastic about our audience, about our subject, then we can maintain that the audience, then we can maintain their attention. Every time we speak, we determine then the attitude of the hearers. If we then hold out a hollow hand, if we are lackadaisical, then they'll be lackadaisical. If we are reserved, then they are reserved. If we are only mildly concerned, they're only going to be mildly concerned. But if we're dead in earnest about what we say, if we say it with feeling and spontaneity, then the force and contagious of conviction is there. Now, we're going to talk about preaching without notes, and this is what we need to. This is where we need to be. Is when we're preaching without notes is that we need to have then this enthusiasm that we have, that he's talking about here in this. Much as we'd like to think we are moved by reason, the world is in fact moved by emotions. And I'm not saying be overly emotional, but what I'm saying is there's a balance between these. And I think that's what he's saying here. You need the enthusiasm when you have your facts, but you need to say them with enthusiasm. The man who tries to be very serious or very witty will easily fail, but the speaker who appeals to you with real conviction never fails, no matter whether the greatest subject to him is the breeding of white leghorns or the blight of Christians in Armenia or the League of Nations. That shows you how old this book is. League of Nations was before United Nations and that type of thing. So if he is deeply convinced so that the message is for you, his speech will go like a flame. And so when we're speaking of those things, I'm preaching on being thankful this Sunday. I think you are too, Jason. So, we need to be enthusiastic about what we're saying. Here is, the attitude of gratitude is what we need to have. And we then ought to have that attitude of gratitude even when we're preaching this sermon. We need to be deeply convicted and convinced about this. Here is what has happened in our nation and what we need to be thankful for. And here's what then we need to be portraying to the people that we're preaching to. And so it is then very important. I know it's hard for preachers week in and week out to do that, but this is something that we need to be doing and paying attention to. Given heat and earnestness and enthusiasm, a speaker's influence will expand like steam. He can have all the faults in the world, but he will hardly fail. He can do a lot of mistakes and grammatically and everything else, but when he has that enthusiasm, when he's speaking then to the heart to heart, it doesn't make any difference. If he has his heart in his message, then it will go to the nation. It will go and be what we want it to be. One of America's most distinguished novelists said, every artist's secret and every public speaker ought to be an artist is passion. So maybe enthusiasm or passion, whatever word that you want to use there, is what we need to have. It is an open secret and perfectly safe. If we all have passion, then passion, feeling, spirit, emotional sincerity, get all of these qualities in your talk and in your sermons, and your audience then will condone, yes, will hardly be conscious of any minor shortcomings that you have. History bears this out. Lincoln spoke in an unpleasant high tone. There's been others who have stuttered. There's been others who have had weak voices. And there's been others almost squeal. And then others' voices have not been clear or pleasant. But all these men that were speaking and doing all of this, they had the earnestness that trumped over their handicaps, an emotional urge that blasted all handicaps to nothingness. So that's how important this is, this enthusiasm. And like I said, sometimes we as preachers and preaching week in and week out, we lose this, but we need to be convinced that our subject is the subject of the need of the hour, that it is the most needed. And I think that we can see that coming up. All right. The essence of a good speech, said one man, a professor, in the New York Times, he had an article in the New York Times, is that the speaker really has something which he really wants to say. Okay. And there was a time when he was a judge, Dale Carnegie was a judge at Columbia University. And there were a half a dozen undergraduates, all of them elaborately trained, all of them anxious to acquit themselves well. But with a single exception, what they were striving for was to win a medal. They had little or no desire to persuade. They had chosen their topic because these topics permitted oratorical development. They had no deep personal interest in the arguments they were making. And their successive speeches then were merely exercise in the art of delivery, with the exception of one person, and he was a Zulu prince. And he had selected as a title the contribution then of Africa to modern civilization. And he put intense feeling into every word he uttered. It was no exercise, no mere exercise. It was a living thing born of conviction and enthusiasm. He spoke as the representative of his people and of his constituents. He had things to say, and he wanted to say them. He said it with sympathetic sincerity. So they gave him the medal. Although he was possibly no more accomplished in the art than 2 or 3 of his competitors. What we judges recognized was that his address had the true fire of an orator. In comparison with his fervent appeal, the other speeches were only gas logs. So that's how important this is. Right here is where many speakers fail. His expression is motivated by no conviction, no desire, no impetus in stirring in his talk. There is no power behind his shot. But how do we develop then enthusiasm? How do we develop this spirit that and earnestness that we're talking about? And you need to be, there are several ways, and he's going to talk about these ways. And then when it's, the listener can detect whether the speaker is thinking from a skin deep impression or whether his expression is well up and deep within him. That's like I've heard people speak on grief, and I could tell real quickly whether they had been through the grieving process themselves. There's just a different speak. There's a different pattern. When you've been there, done that, and lost of a loved one, then it's a different than when you're just speaking clinically. I could tell it. And didn't work for me. I appreciated what they were trying to do, but give me somebody that's been there, done that. I think that's one reason why somebody who counsels drug addicts, if they have been there and done that, make better drug addicts. And I'm not condoning going out there and doing drug and become a drug addict so that you can counsel other people. What I'm saying is that they make the best counselors because they've been there and they've done that and they know how to talk to them and they know what they're going through. And that's true here. That's what we need to go through then. That's what we need to be putting our heart into our work. We need to, when we're studying and we're getting our outlines together, we need to be enthusiastic. We need to see, this is why I need to preach this sermon. Right here, this is why this sermon needs to be preached. I have another book on preaching without notes. And Brother Holland makes reference to this book in his book. And that book, he's got a sermon in there that he preaches without notes. And I thought, this is a great sermon. And it's talking about the lifeline to heaven. And he uses Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8 as his text. For scripture reading, he has Ephesians chapter 1 through 10, which is a great text there. But he's using, by grace are you saved through faith. And he talks about grace is God's part, faith is man's part. Grace is God reaching down, faith is man reaching up. And when man reaches up and touches God, then that's when salvation occurs. He talks about Jacob's ladder, how it descended, and the things that were coming then, the angels that were ascending and descending. And he talked about that and made a comparison with that. Jesus does that in the book of John and makes that comparison there. But this is really good. Then he goes on and he says, here's what Jesus said. And he gives Jesus as believing. He's got Peter saying repentance is necessary. He's got the Apostle Paul saying reconciliation. He's got then the Holy Spirit saying the Spirit and the bride say, come. And I thought, this is a good sermon, especially when we think about the rescues that been in with Michael and Katrina or whatever. Here he is then throwing out the lifeline. And people have got to take that lifeline in order to be saved. When they were in harm's way, if they didn't take that lifeline, they could not be saved. And so here is God throwing out the lifeline. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, he wants all men to be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth. So here is that lifeline then that God provides, and we need to be showing that lifeline to other people. And I thought that was a great. So when we're digging then with this sermon, when we're preparing this sermon, when we're thinking about and getting our rough draft together, and here's what Jesus said, here's what Peter said, here's what Paul said, here's what the Holy Spirit said, the Spirit and the bride say, come. We need to be enthusiastic. We need to be thinking about those things and getting those things then where we need to be. We need to be digging deep on these things. Seek for the hidden resources that lie buried within you, and that comes then from knowing what you're speaking about. Being, when you see these things written down and you say, wow, that is what the Bible says on these things, then we need to be showing that to other people. It makes it very interesting. Let me show you this. When you get up there and you say, well, let me show you this is, and you say, this is interesting to me, but here's what it is. And you show that process. It will be interesting to them, to some anyway. So seek those hidden treasures then. Get the facts and the cause behind the facts. Why did Jesus die for us? Why did God send his only son for us? Because here we are separated from God, death. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 1 and Ephesians chapter 4 verse 18. I've never thought about Ephesians 4:18 along those lines, but he used that. I always used Isaiah 59 verses 1 and 2. But here's what God did for you and for me then. So we're getting then the facts and the cause behind the facts, and then dwell on them, brood over them until it matters to you. And that's that part of studying then, getting that outline together, letting it simmer is what I call it, putting it there and letting it simmer. And then when you get up to preach, then you go over this sermon. And we're going to talk about that in preaching without notes. How do we get to the point where we can preach without notes? And I can understand what we need to be doing. It's hard for me to do it, but it is a great thing if you can do it. That doesn't mean you don't have notes, that you don't have then your notes, because you can have something happen in your audience or something happen to your mind and you can lose your place, and you've always got your notes then tucked away, and you can pull that out and you can find out where you are, you know where you are, and you can start there and you can proceed on. So this is what he's still saying, do all of these things in this, but get enthusiastic when you're doing this. All right, so we need to make thorough preparation for it, and we need to be making the right kind of preparation, and that is the preparation from the heart. It is essential as head preparation. So these things are necessary as we are preparing our sermons week in and week out. Then he talks about also one man then who was speaking to banking and a thrift campaign. And one of the men in particular then lacked force. And he was talking merely because he wanted to speak, not because he had the fire and the zeal for thrift. His first step in training was then to warm his mind and his heart. And he had to then, Dale Carnegie had to tell him to go off by himself and think over his subject until he became enthusiastic about it. I asked him then, and this is Dale Carnegie saying this, to remember that the probate court records in New York City show that more than 85% of the people leave nothing at all at death. That only 3.3% leave $10,000 or over. And you got to understand, when this book was written, that was probably in the 40s. So that's a lot of money for them. He was to keep constantly in mind that he was not asking people to do him a favor or something that they could not afford to do. He was to say to himself, I am preparing these people to have meat and bread and clothes and comfort in their old age, and to leave their wives and their children protected. So when you get that idea of having something for old age, and then if something happens to you, then there is that protection for your wife and your children, that will make you a better salesperson, a better speaker about what you're talking about then. He must remember that he was going out to perform a great social service. He was inspired by the Crusaders' faith that he was preaching the practical, applied the gospel of Jesus Christ. He thought over the facts. He burned them into his mind. He got realizing sense of their importance. He aroused his own interest, stirred his own enthusiasm, and came to feel that his mission was almost holy. Then he went out to talk. There was a ring to his words that carried conviction. In fact, his talk on thrift attracted so much attention that he was invited to join the organization of the largest bank in America. Okay, so that was a great feat for him, but he had to get those things within him. I must live, cried the young man to Voltaire. And the philosopher replied, I do not perceive the necessity. So when we're speaking then, and when we're preaching, can they perceive what the necessity of what we're saying? All right, that is then what we're trying, the attitude of the world towards you and what you would have to say. It won't perceive the necessity of what is being said. But you, if you would succeed, must feel the necessity, if there is one. The thing ought to grip you. It ought, for the time being, to seem like it is the most important thing to you on this earth. Dwight Moody, and I don't know if you know who Dwight Moody was, but he was a Baptist preacher that preached, I think, in Chicago, somewhere up and through there. And his motto was, hit the sawdust trail. I believe it was him. And there are sermons by him too, in sermon books. He was so stirred by the preparation on his sermon on grace, so wrought up in his search for the truth, that it seized his hat. He got his hat, left his study, and went out into the street, and then grabbed the first man that he met and abruptly inquired, do you know what grace is? It is any wonder that a man fired with such emotional earnestness and intensity exerted a magic power over his audience. Some time ago, a member of a course that he was conducting in Paris spoke evening after evening in a colorless fashion. He was nothing of a student. He was something of a student, and he had all his facts right, piles of them, but he had not welded them together with the heat of his own interest. He lacked spirit. He didn't talk as if he wanted to say was very vital. So naturally, the audience paid little heed. They took a speech at his own appraisement, time and again, stopping him. I endeavored to drill force into him, to wake him up, but I often felt as if I were trying to coax steam out of a cold radiator. Finally, then, Dale Carnegie succeeded in persuading him that his method of preparedness was at fault. He convinced him that he ought to establish some kind of telegraphic communication between his head and his heart. He told him that he must give not only the facts, but he also must reveal his attitude towards those facts. Then the next week when he was speaking, he was passionately concerned about something. He had a message that he loved. He was willing to sweat blood for it. And his talk won long and hearty applause. It was an abrupt triumph. He had generated a little heartfelt earnestness that is fundamental in the art of preparation. As he learned that is the art of preparation is so key to it. It does not consist merely in getting some mechanical work down on paper, nor of memorizing phrases. Neither is it consistent in the lifting of a few thoughts secondhand from some book or newspaper articles. It is consists then of digging way down deep in your own mind, in your heart, and in your life, and bringing forth those convictions and enthusiasms that are essentially yours. So dig down deep. It is there, never doubt it. Minds of it, qualities of it, quantities of it, whose existence have you ever have never even dreamed of. Do you yourself realize the strength of your own potentialities? I doubt it. The late Professor James said that the average man does not develop more than 10% of his possible mental powers. Worse than an 8-cylinder machine with only one cylinder sparking. Yes, the great thing in a speech is not the cold phraseology, but the man, the spirit, the conviction behind the phraseology. There was then a speech given in the House of Commons that was delivered by a famous speaker who, when he heard it, wanted to write it down. He wanted it to be recorded. And this fellow says that and there were these groups then that felt that it was the best and the most eloquent oration ever delivered on England soil. And this man that delivered it thought no. He even refused to offer $5,000 for its publication. No copy of it exists today. If we could read the address, no doubt it would be disappointing. The quality that made it great would be gone. Only the empty skin would remain. Like some stuffed eagle with outspread wings in a taxidermy shop. Always remember that you are the most important factor in your talk. Here are the golden words from Emerson. They contain the world of wisdom. Use what language you will. You can never say anything but what you are. That is one of the most significant statements, then, that Dale Carnegie had ever heard about the art of self-expression. Use what language you will. You can never say anything but what you are. Then he also talks about Lincoln, how that Lincoln won a lawsuit. Now, he's already talked about Lincoln and said that he didn't have a real good speaking voice. Okay. There was a widow then of the Revolutionary War that came to Lincoln. She was an old woman, bent with age, and she hobbled into his office, telling him of the pension agent who had taken from her an exorbitant rate of $200 for collecting a sum of twice that amount that was due her. Lincoln was indignant. He brought a suit immediately. How did he prepare for this case? He prepared by reading the biography of Washington and the history of the Revolutionary War. By quickening his enthusiasm, by kindling his feeling and emotion, when he spoke, he recounted the oppressions that stirred the patriots to turn and fight for liberty. He pictured the untold hardship that they had gone through, the sufferings that they endured at Valley Forge, hungry, barefooted, and with bleeding feet creeping over ice and snow. Then in wrath, he turned to the rascal who had fleeced the widow of one of those heroes of half her pension. His eyes flashed as he poured out his bitterness and indignation, skinning the defendant as he declared he would do. Time rolls by, he said in his conclusion. The heroes of 76 have passed away and are encamped on the other shore. The soldiers has gone to rest, and now, crippled, blind, and broken, his widow comes to you and to me, gentlemen of the jury, to right her wrongs. She was not always thus. She was once a beautiful young woman. Her steps was elastic. Her face was fair. Her voice was sweet as any that rang in the mountains of old Virginia. But now she is poor and defenseless, out here on the prairies of Illinois, many hundreds of miles away from the sense of her childhood. She appeals to us who enjoy the privileges achieved for us by the patriots of the Revolution, for our sympathetic aid and manly protection. All I ask is, shall we befriend her? As he finished, some of the jury were in tears, and they returned a verdict for every cent the old woman asked. Lincoln became her surety for cost, paid her hotel bill and her fare home, and charged her nothing for his legal services. A few days later, Lincoln's partner picked up a little scrap of paper in the office and read Lincoln's outline for his speech and burst into his laughter. This is all that it was on this little piece. No contract, not professional services, unreasonable charge, money retained by defendant, not given to plaintiff, Revolutionary War, described Fort Valley, the plaintiff's husband, soldier leaving for army, skin defendant, closed. Not much there, not much needed, but he had the passion that he needed then to get his message across to these. So here is then what we need is enthusiasm, and the next thing we need is earnestness. Okay. Actions and feelings go together. And by regulating the action, which is under the most direct control of the will, we can indirectly regulate the feeling, which is not. So, to feel earnest and enthusiastic, stand up, act in earnest, and be enthusiastic. Stop leaning against the table, stand tall, stand still. And I don't think he's talking about don't use hand gestures, but stand still. Don't rock back and forth. Don't bob up and down. Don't shift your weight from one foot to the other and back again like a tired horse. In short, don't make nervous movements. That's what he's talking about. Nervous movements, which will proclaim your lack of ease and self-possession to the housetops. Control yourself physically. It will convey a sense of poise and power. Stand up, stand out, like a strong man rejoicing in to run a race. Fill your lungs with oxygen. Fill them to the full. Look straight at your audience. Look at them as if you had something urgent to say, and as if you knew it were urgent. Look at them with the confidence and the courage of a teacher reviewing his pulpit, that you are the teacher and they are there to hear you and to be taught by you. So speak out confidently and with energy. Lift up your voice like the prophet Isaiah. Lift it up. Be not afraid. And then he says, use emphatic gestures. So when he says stand still, he's not talking about don't use gestures. Never mind just now whether it is beautiful or graceful. Think only of making them forcefully and spontaneously. Make them now. not for the sense that they will covet to what they will convey to others, but what they will do for you, and they will do wonders. Even if you are speaking to a radio audience, jester, and jester. And it is important. I've spoken on the radio, and it is really key. I look at that mic, and that is my audience, and I make them gestures, just like I'm doing right here. I make gestures then I guess it can come over the radio waves. I don't know, but it helps me, and it helps everything. All right, your gestures won't, of course, be visible on the radio to the unseen hearers, but the results of your gestures will be audible to them. They will give increased aliveness and energy to your tones and into your whole manner. I guess when he's teaching this, he's stopped lifeless speakers in the midst of a talk and drilled him and compelled him to use emphatic gestures, which he did not at the time feel like using, but the physical action of forced gestures finally awakened and stimulated him until his gestures were gestured spontaneously. So it needs to be that way. Even his face brightened and his whole bearing and his attitude became more earnest and emphatic. Acting in earnest makes one feel in earnest. Assume a virtue, Shakespeare advised, if you have it not. Okay. Above all else, open your mouth and speak out. Make sure that you can be heard in the back of the auditorium. And that's always what I've strived to tell folks. When I'm teaching my class on public worship and that type of thing, get those people then, the class, to stand in the back and get somebody to speak then up at the front at the Lord's table and see if they can be heard in the back. We need to be speaking, and especially with prayers, people will just kind of mumble and not be heard. Folks, we need to get through that. We need to speak out and speak up. It doesn't have to, and a prayer doesn't have to be eternal to be good. It doesn't have to go on and on and on and on and on and on to be good. A short prayer is just as effective as a long prayer. But we need to be able to speak up. We need to be heard in those things. When they're offering prayer for the fruit of the vine and for the bread, they need to be heard throughout the whole audience, even if it means getting a mic up there. I don't like to hear myself. Well, get over it. We need to be heard. This is a public prayer, and it is for everybody. The average man who attempts to speak in public cannot be heard 30 feet away. Now, you think about where the pulpit is and 30 feet away. If you have then the pulpit, you have the Lord's table there, and then you have the first row. That's 15, 20 feet right there. All depends on where you are. Here he sat then in the fourth row and could hardly hear more than half of what was said. The ambassador of an important European nation recently delivered the commencement exercise address before the Union College, and his delivery was so flabby that his words were almost inaudible 20 feet from the platform. If experienced preachers commit such errors, what is to be expected then from a beginner? He is not used to having his voice enlarged so that it will carry over the audience. So he speaks sufficiently in vitality. He will imagine that he is fairly shouting and that people are ready to laugh at him. But that's not true. You've got to understand, people need to hear you in the back. Use conversational tones, but enlarge them, intensify them. We can read fine print a foot from the eye, but it takes bold headlines to be seen across the hall. The same thing is true with your voice. Speak up. You got something to say? Speak up so people can hear you. All right, the first thing to do when the audience goes to sleep. A country preacher once asked Henry Ward Beecher how to keep a Sunday afternoon audience awake and he says a hot Sunday afternoon. So, usually on a hot Sunday afternoon, they've eaten and they're comfortable, they're sitting, and they're easily just going to sleep. And Beecher told him to have the usher use a sharp stick and prod the preacher. Okay, I think that's really good. It is glorified common sense. It would do more for the average speaker than 9/10 of all the tomes that have ever been written on the art of eloquence. One of the surest ways to get the student is to limber up, okay, and abandon really let himself go. Would be to knock him down before he started. Fire and spirit and aliveness to his speech. Actors do this. They shake themselves awake before they make their stage entrance. Houdini did it by leaping about the backstage, striking the air vigorously with his fist, sparring with an imaginary antagonist. Then others deliberately planned to work himself into perfect rage over any pretext. Perhaps it was because some stagehand had breathing too audibly, any excuse that would serve to give him the heightened energy and the surge of the spirit that he courted. I've seen actors standing in the wings and waiting for their cues and beating their breasts savagely. Sent students just before they spoke into an adjoining room to pummel their bodies until their blood leaped and their faces were red and faces and eyes glowed with life. I frequently force students to preface their practice talks in this course, repeating the ABCs with violent gestures and all the vigor and anger that he could possibly command. Isn't it highly desirable to go before the hearers like a thoroughbred straining at the bit? Immediately before you speak, get, if possible, thorough rest. The ideal thing is to then go to bed and then, if possible, then take get woke up, okay? And he has some different ways of getting woke up, but cold water, whatever it takes, but get woke up and be enthusiastic about it. Get ready for this. Let's see, the kind of acting or speaking that counts consumes a lot of nerve, force, and physical energy. And there, it really does. If you're speaking correctly, it takes a lot of energy out of you. Somebody has said that he chopped down hickory trees and split logs and have talked to audience for 2 hours at a time. I have found that one of these tasks is about as exhausting as the others. During the war, Dudley Field Malone had a passionate appeal to a large audience assembled in the Century Theater in New York. At the climax of it, after speaking for an hour and a half, he fainted from sheer exhaustion and was carried unconscious from the stage. One man, Sidney Smith, described Daniel Webster as a steam engine in trousers. The most successful speakers, declared Beecher, are the men of great vitality and recuperative force, men who have preeminently the explosive power by which they can thrust their materials out. They are catapults, and men go down before them. Then he talks about weasel words and onions. And I'm going to go straight through. If you need to take a break, you can take a break and come back and watch this, but I'm going straight through. Put energy, then, what you say, behind what you say, and say it positively. But don't be too positive. Only ignoramus is positive about everything, and only a weakling prefaces every mark with, it seems to me, or perhaps, or in my opinion. We need to get out of that, especially in preaching. It seems to me, or perhaps, or in my opinion. Your opinion doesn't make any difference. What we want is God's word. So the most universal trouble with beginning speakers is not that they're too positive, but that they have their talks with these timid phrases. Okay. There was a New York businessman described a motor trip through Connecticut. On the left side of the road, he said, there seemed to be a field of onions. Now, there was no seeming about the onions. Either they were or they were not. And it does not require extraordinary powers to recognize an onion field when one sees it. This shows to what absurd length a speaker will sometimes go. Weasel words is what Roosevelt called such expression. For a weasel sucks the heart out of an egg and leaves nothing but an empty shell. That is what these phrases do to your talk. Shrieking, apologetic tones, and eggshell phrases will not beget much confidence and conviction. Imagine business houses using slogans such as this. It seems like to us the Underwood is the machine you will eventually buy. Underwood was a type of typewriter. In our opinion, the Prudential has the strength of Gibraltar. And that's a life insurance, and they still use the Rock of Gibraltar as their insignia. We think you will use our flour eventually. Why not now? That's not going to get you many sales. In 1896, when Bryant first ran for the presidency, he was very emphatic about his speech, and he was so declared that he would be elected, and McKinley would go down in defeat. The explanation then was simple of why he did this. Bryant knew that the people in mass cannot differentiate between emphasis and truth. He knew that if he said a thing often enough and vigorously enough, most of the hearers would end by believing it. The world's greatest leaders have thundered forth as if there was no possibility on top of the seven seas for anyone invalidating their assertion. When Buddha was dying, he did not reason or whine or argue. He spoke as one having authority. Walk as I have commanded you. The Koran, which has affected millions of lives and as false as it can be, says that there is no doubt in this book. It is a direction. Okay. When the jailer at Philippi asked Paul, what must I do to be saved? The answer was not an argument. It was, it seems to me, or I think assertion. It came, a superior command, believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and thou shalt be saved. Told him exactly what to do. But do not, as I have said, be too positive on all occasions. There are times and there are places, there are subjects, there are audiences where too much positiveness will hinder rather than help. In general, the higher the level of intelligence of one's hearers, the less successful mere forceful assertions will be. Thinking people want to be led, not driven. That's what elders are to do. That's what we are to be doing, is leading people, not driving people. They want to have the facts presented and to draw their own conclusions. You might help them draw conclusions like that. They like to be asked questions, not to have a ceaseless stream of direct statements poured out them. Next on our list then of keeping this audience awake is you need to love your audience. Okay, a few years ago, Dale Carnegie trained a number of public lecturers in England. After painfully and costly trials, 3 of them had to be dismissed and 1 had to be sent back to America. Their main trouble was that they were not genuinely interested in serving their audience. They were chiefly concerned not about others, but about themselves, their pay envelopes, and everyone could feel it. They were cold to their audience. Their audience return were cold to them. Consequently, these speakers remained sounding brass and tinkling cymbals. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. If we don't have then love, that's what we become. And he uses that illustration there to become a sounding brass and a tinkling cymbal, and uses that as eloquence. If we don't have love, and that's what he's talking about there. A well-known human race is very quick to detect whether a talk is coming from above the eyebrows or back of the breastbone. Even a dog can sense that. Lincoln, as a public speaker, was not very good public speaker, but he was a most loved man. The unquestionable, he delivered some of America's best speeches. Although he was a genuine in some ways, I'm inclined to believe that his power with audience was due in no small measures to his sympathy and honesty and goodness. He loved people. His heart, said his wife, is as large as his arms are long. He was Christ-like. And 2,000 years ago, one of the first books ever written on this art described the eloquent talker as a good man skilled in speaking. The secret of my success, said one person, one prima donna, is absolute devotion to the audience. I love my audience. They are all my friends. I feel a bond with them the moment I step before them, so that was the secret of her worldwide triumph. Let us strive to cultivate the same spirit. The finest thing in speaking is neither physical or mental. It is spiritual. The book of Daniel Webster had on his pillow while dying is a book that every speaker should have on his desk while living. Jesus loved men, and their hearts burned within them as he talked with them by the way. You want a splendid text on public speaking? Why not read your New Testament? Okay, that's what we've been asked for after, and that's what we've been trying to do. All right, summarize then what we're talking about. Every time you speak, you determine the attitude of your hearers toward what they say or what you say. If you are lackadaisical, they are lackadaisical. If you are only mildly concerned, they're only mildly concerned. If you are enthusiastic, they will be sure to catch something of your spirit. Enthusiasm is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, factors in delivery. The man who tries, number 2, the man who tries to be very serious or very witty may easily fail, but the speaker who appeals to you with real conviction never fails. If he is really deeply convicted so that he has a message for you, his speech will go like a flame. Number 3, in spite of tremendous importance of this quality of contagiousness, conviction, enthusiasm, most men lack it. Number 4, the essence of a good speech is that the speaker really has something which he really wants to say. Okay, then burn that into your heart. Something that you really want to say. Think over your facts. Burn them. Their real importance. Why are they important to you? Why are they important to your audience? Burn that into your mind then. Get that in there. Try your own enthusiasm before you attempt to convince others. Establish a telegraphic communication between your heart and your head. We want not only you to give us the facts, but to reveal your attitude towards those facts. Use what language you will. You can never say anything but what you are. The big thing in a speech is not his words, but the spirit of the man behind the words. Number 8, to develop earnestness, to feel enthusiastic, act enthusiastic, stand tall, look straight at your audience, use emphatic gestures. Above all else, number 9, open your mouth and speak so that you can be heard. Many speakers cannot be heard 30 feet away. Number 10, when a country minister asked Henry Ward Beecher what to do when an audience went to sleep on a hot Sunday afternoon, have the usher use a sharp stick and prod the preacher. This is one of the best bits of advice that ever can be given to a public speaker. Then don't weaken your speech with weasel words, such as it seems to me, in my humble opinion. And then lastly, love your audience. So maybe that will help. And if you put some of those things to practice in your speaking, then it will hopefully help you in your public speaking. I hope, and I'm going to try some of these things too. This has been a really good thing for me. And I want then to start, and I don't know how far we'll get on also tonight, on preaching without notes. I think this is a very good thing to preach without notes. I don't do it. I haven't done it very often, but I think it is a good thing to do. And he then says we need to preach from the heart. And that's what Dale Carnegie said, and that's what we were talking about in preaching with enthusiasm. And I think this goes hand in hand. When we're talking about preaching without notes and enthusiasm, then they go hand in hand. But there is a way then to do preaching without notes. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not prepared. What that means is that you get you get up in the audience in front of the people and you speak then to your audience without notes, without looking down. And that's not always easy. It's not, so it takes practice. It takes then, and we'll get into what it takes to get to there. But have the spontaneity and deliver that will refresh the preacher and the audience. That's why I don't like a written sermon, because there's no spontaneity to it, to me. I can't use that. I get lost in it also. But I want that spontaneity. I want to be able to preach a sermon in one place and then turn around and you preach it in another place with the same people in the audience, and it'd be a different sermon. I really like that idea. So there's some things, though, that when I want to say something, if I want it down, I put it in the outline. If there's a comment or maybe a quotation that I want, I'll make that part of my outline. But anyway, B.C. Goodpasture's father encouraged him to speak without notes, or as his father said, shoot without a rest. And if you understand what the shoot without a rest is, you don't rest your gun on something. That's what he's talking about. The father insisted that a preacher did not know his lessons unless he could recite without a book. The son, therefore, was not or has not used a note in preaching within the last 40 years. He believes almost anyone can preach without notes if he is willing to pay the price. Study until he knows his subject. Okay. Preaching without note does not mean that one preaches without making adequate preparation. The emphasis in this chapter is not on the impromptu sermon delivery. Preaching without notes does not mean that one will not use notes in preparation for a sermon. We've talked about that, and it is important that you do that. It does mean that the thoroughness of preparation enables the preacher to maintain eye contact with the audience and preach with power. That's that enthusiasm that we talked about. By all means, the best way to preach is extemporaneously, without notes. And that's what I'm talking about too. That's why my whole idea is without writing it down word for word. Now, I understand doing that. You'll make less grammatical mistakes, but if you have the power, the enthusiasm behind your speech, you won't have to worry about whether you conjugated the verb correctly or not. That won't make that big a difference. Okay, but your sermon will be remembered. That's why we use certain things in our sermons. Use short sentences as our main points. Then complete sentences, and they may all start the same way. They may have the same number of words in them. It's very, there's a lot of memory helps that you can use. A lot of preachers will use and Winford Clark was good about this. If you look in the books, expositions of the expositor, he used a lot of that. He started every main point with the same letter, and then a lot of times when he used the same letter in the same, the first one, if he used A there, all the subpoints might start with B, or C or D or whatever, and then the second point might be starts with C, and then all of his minor points then started with the same letter also. So that's one way to do that. And what you get into then to help you in preaching without notes. And I don't remember Winford Clark preaching with notes. I don't think that Franklin Camp preached with notes. Don't remember hearing, and I know I did, Gus Nichols preach, and I don't know if he preached with notes or not. Tom Holland, I don't remember seeing him use notes. Dan Winkler, don't remember him using notes either. So there are ways around that. A lot of times some preachers will use wide margins Bibles, and they have then their notes in their wide margin, or they may have, this is point 1 here, and they'll do that, and then point 2 is on page whatever, or in this passage, and they'll do that. So they have then those helps in their Bibles, and they can preach then without notes before them, but they still have some way to do this. There are 4 possible ways that a preacher could deliver a sermon. There are advantages and disadvantages in each of these methods. Yet, after analysis of each, it should be evident that the extemporaneous method is to be preferred. First, one could deliver an impromptu sermon. The preacher would, on the spur of the moment, deliver a sermon. Now, I have done that before. Got in the audience, and maybe somebody said something to me between class time and the preaching. But that doesn't mean that it was impromptu. I preached without notes, but that doesn't mean that I didn't have something already studied in my mind to do that. And I've been, I've been cautioned that in every situation, when you walk into any audience or any auditorium, you be ready to speak. You may not be asked to speak, and that's great and good, but you be ready to. Had one of my instructors at Memphis, Brother Young, walked into a funeral home, and I think like 5 minutes before the funeral began, he was told that he was going to preach then the funeral, and had not been told that before then. So he had 5 minutes to get something ready. So always be ready. Have something somewhere in your mind. That's why I said, have a sermon. I preached last Sunday on stop, look, and listen from Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. Stop your sinning, looking unto Jesus, and then hear. And I took the idea from a crossing, a railroad crossing. And so you can keep that in your mind. There may be some sermons then that you'll want to put in the front of your Bible or in the back of your Bible, that if you're ever asked then, that you'll have something there. But always be ready on this spur of the moment. But like I said, it's not impromptu. You've already made some preparation. You're ready to step into it. So anyway, be ready. The preacher would take into consideration, if he's doing this, the immediate needs of the audience, assuming that he would know the audience well enough to be familiar with the most acute problems or needs. On the basis of his immediate evaluation, he then decides on the text and an approach. He must rely on his previous training and experience for the information he presents in a sermon. I couldn't do that consistently. But I have done it before, but I was prepared. One could certainly preach to the needs of the audience if he waited until they assemble. Perhaps most preachers have had the frustrating experience of preparing a lesson for non-Christians only to find when the time came for delivery that the audience was composed of Christians. And yes, and sometimes I've had lessons that somebody asked me to preach, and when I got ready to preach them, they were not in the audience. And so, I've had that too. So, you've got that type of thing too. Some preachers contend that they do a better job when they preach impromptu sermons. However, it is easy for a preacher to confuse a ready flow of words with worthwhile ideas. The danger of perverting the scriptures by taking a verse out of context, or the danger of failing to adequately explain a matter, and the extreme tension and concern based on the realization that one has not thought the subject through, should reveal the real liability of an impromptu delivery. And that's why I say that's not something I would do. A lot of times, like I said, I've already studied this, and maybe that's been my own personal study. Somebody's made a comment to me, and I thought, well, I'll just preach on this then this morning. I haven't done that very often, but I've done it a couple of times. All right, so second of all, there is this manuscript discourse that offers another possibility of sermon delivery. This means that the sermon is written prior to preaching situation, but is read in delivery exactly as it is written. Of course, this permits careful attention to be given to the selection of exact words to communicate the thoughts of the sermon. Robert Taylor does this. I don't know if you've ever listened to Robert Taylor, but if you ever get the opportunity, and he's at a place where they have then it written out. I know at Memphis School of Preaching, when I've been to their lectures, and he closes out, you can take the book and you can follow word for word what he says. It is exactly, that's what he's done for years. And if you read his book, his biography, I think his wife wrote that, or autobiography, he'll tell you why in there that he's done that. Also then, if one is to discuss a controversial subject where he may be quoted, he has proof of really what he said, assuming the possibility of one being misquoted. That's why a lot of places then are recording the sermons, is because preachers have been misquoted and have been taken out of context. So you can look at the context, and people can look at the context, and they can look at the whole thing, and they can see. However, there are apparent weakness in the manuscript sermon delivery. In many instances, the sermon will seem dull or dry to the audience. 2, unless the preacher is an expert reader, he cannot maintain the important eye contact with the audience. Furthermore, circumstances may arise during the course of preaching the sermon that would cause one to feel compelled to discuss one particular aspect of the subject that was not included in the manuscript. If one leaves the manuscript momentarily, the problem of an extemporaneous delivery and the correlation with the manuscripts becomes very real. All right? It was true in colonial America that the practice of reading long sermons was in vogue. It is also true that during this time, men were stationed at various places in the meeting house with switches to keep the attention. Thirdly, one could deliver a sermon from memory. The preacher could give careful attention to word choices, and he could state his ideas very exactly if he memorized his sermon. But there are real difficulties involved in the memorization of sermons word for word. The demands on the preacher's time would make it almost impossible chore to memorize 2 sermons each week. Then you have Bible classes too, and then if you have other preaching engagements, to do that. In all probability, the sermon will sound like a memorized sermon when it's delivered. 2, there could be no allowance to alter the emphasis in delivery, repeat a point which the audience seemingly missed, and or elaborate on a passage or an idea which seems to further need discussion. Furthermore, the preacher will be under constant strain from the realization that if he forgets a sentence or 2 in the sermon, he can be thrown off the whole line of thought. Okay? And that's a real thing. Fourthly, the sermon delivered extemporaneously are effective. The preacher makes adequate preparation. That is, he knows generally what he's going to say prior to the time of preaching situation. I guess that's what I'm trying to get you to do with your outlines. It's not exact word for word, but you know generally what you're going to say. And he looks forward to the time when he can deliver the message. That's why you practice that. It may not be the same thing, but you can say, well, I emphasize this too wrong. I don't like the way I emphasize this, and you can change that while you're practicing. The ideas for sermon have been thought through in advance. The preacher depends on the mental discipline for the occasion to enable him to find the proper words to express the ideas. And if you practice this, you'll have pretty much the ideas there. The part of preparation for extemporaneous delivery is the memorizing of the preaching outline and the delivering of the sermon without relying on notes. And I'm going to go ahead and give you this. He'll talk about this in this lesson too. But when you do this, you work on your sermon every day. And memorization every day. So it's not something that you need to do at one setting. It's something that it will help your memory if you do it a little bit every day. That's like memorizing your scriptures. If you'll do a little bit every day, it will help you in the long run. 2 pertinent questions relative to preaching without notes. Why should one strive to master this type of delivery? And how can this be accomplished? Okay. These questions are obviously in logical order. It is foolish to discuss the how unless it is really convinced that it pays to preach without notes. One of the distinct advantages of preaching without notes is the fact that preacher can maintain eye contact with his audience at all times. The preacher may actually communicate feelings such as enthusiasm that we talked about in the first hour, interest, sincerity with his eyes. Furthermore, he can observe the listening behavior of the audience. You know, it's interesting how we communicate and how much we do communicate with facial expressions, with our eyes. And I've noticed this in the past week or so. People have asked me a question and I haven't even answered them with a word and got my idea across. It's really, it's interesting how we can do that. So we can do that then with our eyes. Eye contact with the audience is a real attention factor. When the speaker looks constantly at his notes or the floor or the ceiling or the window, we tend to lose interest in what he is saying and may even be inclined to distrust him. No one preacher, and he was a pretty good preacher too, But he wouldn't look at the audience. He looked at the back right corner or the back left corner. And every once in a while, he'd look at his audience. Most of the time, he was looking over this way. And you could tell by his eyes he wasn't looking at the audience. And if you're speaking and you've got a big audience, you may pick out just 2 or 3 people on one side and then on the other side. And then if it's a fan type thing, you may not look directly at everybody, but you can get somebody's attention by looking in the areas that you're looking at and maintain that contact. And then somebody may throw you a puzzled look, and you can see that too without a lot of distraction. And in addition to the eye contact featured of the note-free preaching, one can make the audience feel that he is talking directly and personally to the hearers. The audience wants to be important enough to the preacher that he is willing to communicate with them. Okay, that's why you look at people individually. Sermons must be maybe preacher-centered, subject-centered, or audience-centered. If the preacher is interested primarily in the way he looks, I think he needs to be to some degree, and sounds, and if he mainly is concerned with creating the proper impression of himself, he is a preacher-centered. Jesus said that the righteousness of the disciples was not a mere manner of display in Matthew chapter 6. The preacher may be preoccupied with his studies to the extent that he does not really care how people respond to the sermon, so long as he can walk into the pulpit and give his scholarship an opportunity to prove itself. If the preacher is primarily interested in the subject, he will probably preach subject-oriented sermons. This is really what Dale Carnegie that we talked about in the last hour talked about. You need to be love your audience. In reality, the preacher should strive to preach audience-centered sermons. One should not preach for preaching's sake, but for the audience's sake and to please God. The hearer wants to feel that a preacher is talking directly to him. This impression can be made if the preacher is really enthusiastic about his sermon and if he has made adequate preparation whereby he can preach without notes. Charles W. Kohler, and this is the man that has a book on preaching without notes, and I recommend it. He gives in that one chapter, he gives essentially the same thing that Brother Holland is doing in this one, and really it follows the same outline. But it has some other helps in it too. He's the one that I told you about the Sermon on Grace. One of the greatest joys of the ministry is spontaneity of note-free preaching. There is a real thrill that comes to the preacher when he can stand before the audience with a scriptural lesson so well prepared that he can look the audience in the eye and deliver the goods. To see how much an audience appreciates this type of preparation is also very rewarding to the preacher. Now, the second question is, how can one develop the ability to preach without notes? Okay. So, the how of note. Well, the first, then, there are 3 steps to this, and all 3 steps are closely connected. The first one is saturate. He must saturate himself with the subject. That's when you study, you get all of those things involved, and you get your outline down and that type of thing. You are saturating yourself. Good pastor believes that almost anyone can preach without notes if he is willing to pay the price. Study until he knows the subject. This means that a decision as to the sermon subject must be made well in advance of the preaching situation. And I've talked to you about that. And getting your sermons then prepared for a year, at least a year in advance. You need to start working now on 2019 of what you're going to preach. If you're going to preach on Sunday and you're waiting to Saturday night before the sermon is delivered, it's not going to be very good. If one is working regularly with the same congregation, he could, with little profit, plan a year of preaching. And I think that's so adequate, so true. The year plan could be checked for balance and a spiritual diet. And I think that is why you need to be, because we have a tendency to get on a hobby or get on a subject. And so this will keep you from doing that very thing. So that's why I am all in favor of getting, making it out, a year plan. Ample time for seeking material and meditation upon the various subjects would be afforded. All right. There's Bacon's rule then would apply to the necessity of preacher saturating himself with the subject. Reading maketh a full man. Writing maketh the exact man. The preacher must read extensively and write constantly. If he will saturate himself with the subject, the preacher must preach from an overflow of general study. His whole educational background, specifically his Bible study and training, plus his specific sermon preparation. That's why when you go to like a Georgia School of Preaching or Memphis School of Preaching or these other schools of preaching, they'll give you a good Bible general, and you'll use those things. Bible geography and that type of thing will help you. History, that type of scheme of redemption, all of those things will help you in your preaching and give you a better knowledge of those things. All right, so we've talked about then we need to saturate. Number two, then, we need to be organized, or the organization of the sermon material. So here is what he was talking about, and when we talk about outlining our material, then here is that logical way to go from a rough draft to a preaching draft, I think is what he calls it. An outline then. An outline carried through a rough draft, refined outline, and finally the finished product or the preaching outline should be fairly well fixed in the preacher's mind. Kohler observed that with a good outline, the preacher commits to memory a progression of thoughts rather than words. Okay, so that's why your main topics, your main points are so important. So you organize those things. And like I said, you may start them with the same word. You may start them, acrostic sermons are good sermons that way to do. We'll talk some about that also when we talk about visual aids and some different visual aids that you can use in your preaching then. All right, the third step then is memorization, okay? And memorization of the outline. I think you need to memorize a lot of your scriptures too. Perhaps half of the total effort expanded in saturation. And then the other 40% is in organization. And the final 10% is in memorization. Many preachers have a greater potential for memorization than they realize. No doubt, some simply need more confidence in their ability to remember. A noted psychologist stated that the average man does not use above 10% of his actual inherited capacity for memory. He wastes the 90% by avoiding the natural laws of remembering. And he gives us 3 natural laws of remembering. And all systems for remembering are based on these laws: impression, association, and repetition. I think he says that Thomas Jefferson had the 3 laws for, I read that somewhere. There it is. Thomas Jefferson had observed that there are 3 laws of learning: repetition, repetition, repetition. That is so true. All right. let's see. One must get a vivid and lasting impression of what he wishes to memorize. The preacher should really be impressed by the need, by the power, and by the truthfulness of the sermon. Impression in preaching as an oral interpretation precedes expression. So here he is that. I think this all comes down to your preparation. Your memorization then comes from your preparation. It's an outgrowth of your preparation. Impression then demands concentration. The preacher must cultivate the ability to keep his mind focused on the sermon outline in spite of competing stimuli. External environment can have an influence here. There can be things happening in the audience. Not so much, but when CBs were the rage, a lot of times they would come in over the PA system if the PA system wasn't done right, and there was a problem. And that would be an external stimuli that he's talking about. Develop internally the ability to concentrate on the natural law of memory. Association is another one of these natural laws of remembering. See the sermon outline on the card or the sheet on which it is written. By means of indentation, underlining, symbolization, associate the part of the material with the whole. All right. And then repetition is an indispensable in remembering. Thomas Jefferson observed that there are 3 laws of learning, and that is repetition, repetition, repetition. The preacher should read the outline and then close his eyes and associate each part of the sermon with its position on the paper. Perhaps one first learns only the introduction, then progresses to the main points with subordinate material. Finally, the points of the conclusion are memorized. Let the preacher close his eyes and see if he has a mental picture of the entire outline. Now, let him relate to himself the points of the outline. That's one way to do it. And there are helps in that. Like I said, preachers use that all the time. It is expedient to spend 3 or 4 sessions in memorizing the outline rather than attempting to do it at one setting. The preacher who sits down and goes over and over the sermon outline until he finally fixes it in his memory will probably consume twice the time of a man who repeats the process at planned intervals. This is the same thing in studying too. If you go to school, if you'll study a little bit every day, then you'll be fine. You'll be a lot better when your test comes than a person who tries to cram. So study a little bit every day. It will help then. The internal then will allow the subconscious mind to work. And when the mind is applied at intervals, it is not strained to the point of fatigue by unbroken application. I remember hearing Foy Wallace talk about preparing for debates, and he would have to hold his eyes open. And I thought, man, I'd have been better off taking me a little nap and getting back up and being fresh and studying those things rather than trying to stay awake and trying to do it that way. All right, the following specific techniques for remembering could be helpful. Have a mental set or intention to remember. Number 2, react actively to the experience should you remember. Look, listen, talk, and think about it. Number 3, refresh your memory of it at strategic times to keep it from going stale. Number 4, keep your thoughts on the meaning of what you intentionally store away. Number 5, common sense rules. Write it down. The preacher who experienced the thrill spontaneous of note-free preaching are more than amply repaid for the additional time required to prepare to preach without a crutch. Preaching without notes does not mean that one preaches without making adequate preparation. Neither does it mean that preparation is made without notes, nor does it mean that the preacher will not have. This is important. Okay? If you don't get anything else, get this tonight. Okay? This you can probably see this again. All right? Nor does it mean that the preacher will not have an outline in his pocket or in his Bible in case of a mental block. It does not have to be a full outline. It doesn't have to be like you're handing in to me, but it may be just your main points, something to get you back onto what you're talking about. It does mean that the preacher knows where he plans to go in the sermon. He has a goal in mind. That's that thesis statement. He communicates with words and eyes. He preaches with a power that blesses man, and he lets the preacher know the real joy and satisfaction of note-free preaching. All right. So, like I said, there will be no class next week. We have Thanksgiving. So get you some Thanksgiving pants. You know what those are, don't you? Those are ones that have elastic in them. So that when you eat, you don't have to worry about your belt. So have you some of that? Enjoy your family. Enjoy your food. Enjoy your time together. Enjoy football. Then we'll come back and we'll talk about and then see, we'll have 3 more classes and then on the final, then the 18th, right before Christmas. Sorry about that, but that's the way it worked out. So have that for you. All right, appreciate it. We'll see y'all week after next.